Today's talk is part of our lecture series, Conversations in Forest History. Our guest today is biographer Will McLean Greeley. His presentation comes from his book, A Connecticut Yankee Goes to Washington. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to our guest.
Well, thank you very much, Jamie. It's a pleasure to be here today. I appreciate the opportunity to present about my book. This was a labor of love. I've completed it in 2023, probably a 4-year research and writing process. And one of my mentors during that time said that the most enjoyable part of writing a book is doing talks like this. And that's certainly true. It's a lot of work to write a book, the revisions, working with editors, the research process. There are over 300 sources for my book, and it really was a very time-consuming project that lasted, I thought would be 2 or 3 years, but it was more like four to five. So it's a great pleasure to be able to share with you today. I know that the Forest History Society is very rich in what it does, and I'm just discovering many of your resources because my next project involves looking at the relationship between deforestation and bird populations, and I've come across some excellent work that Jamie has shared with me relating to that and some other topics. So he and I talked before. I've added a couple of slides that I think will be of real interest to you with a forestry interest. McLean's life dovetailed with many other conservation activities, and so I have a couple of new things here today to share with you. But in many ways, I brought my presentation to 40,000 foot level because I realized that time is limited. 20 to 25 minutes is a good amount for a presentation, but I'm going to really take this at the 40,000 foot level in respect for your time. So I'm going to be very mindful of that as we go along. So my presentation is really in 3 parts. First, I want to introduce you to Senator George P. McLean. Many of you might not know who he was. Some of you might know about the act that has his name, the Weeks-McLean Act, which is bird protection legislation still in effect today. But you probably don't know much more beyond that. So I'm just going to very briefly introduce you to who he was and why he's important. Second part of my presentation is just to touch on 3 challenges that really shaped and equipped him. He was 61 years old when the Migratory Bird Treaty Act passed in 1918. And one of the themes of my book is that the experiences that he had leading up to age 61 uniquely equipped and prepared him for the struggle that he went through to get this very important legislation passed. And lastly, I'm going to touch upon his legacy. I've included a couple overarching themes that I'll be touching on as I talk today. And the first one is it's very difficult to lead change. Many of you might know that in your own lives. Perhaps you've been in a leadership position where you had to lead a particularly difficult change or try to initiate change. People are resistant to it. And so it takes a special kind of person to lead change. And I'll be sharing with you some insights today as to why I think McLean was just such a special person to lead this very important piece of legislation. Secondly, McLean was definitely in the sweet spot of what we call the progressive era, which I'm sure you're familiar with, somewhere around 1900 to 1920. Many historians say that era occurred. And this was a time of badly needed reforms. I like to think of the progressive era as the cleanup period from the Gilded Age that preceded it. There was a great deal of growth and industrialization that occurred after the Civil War. And this was in many ways unrestrained activities. And it led to a number of social, economic, political, and environmental problems that were left to this group of leaders in the progressive era after 1900 to try to fix many of these problems that occurred in the decades leading up to it. This quote from Abraham Lincoln really captures another overarching theme of my book. Lincoln says, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. We must think anew and act anew." I believe that the reformers of the progressive era were confronted with many problems that had been building for over 100 years since their nation's founding. And in many ways, the way that the government was set up were creating some problems that needed to be looked at in a fresh way. And you'll see as I go along in my remarks that the reformers were faced with many challenges that were cried out for new solutions. So I told you I was going to introduce you to George P. McLean. I'm just going to make two quick points. One is he led a very interesting life. I love presidents. I love reading about them. I committed myself to many years ago to read a biography about every president, and I think I'm pretty well there. But he knew 8 presidents, and 6 of them he knew very, very well. 4 of them he fished with, he hunted with, they visited him at his estate. And so there are many anecdotes about these presidents. And one of the things I like to share with people who have an interest in history, that if you read my book, I think it will deepen your appreciation for many of these presidents. You'll see them from a slightly different perspective. And I've always felt that that's a very enriching way to deepen one's learning, is to read about people you're familiar with, but in a slightly different perspective. McLean was also a lifelong politician. He had a 35-year political career I'll be touching on, and he was immensely wealthy. He was a corporate lawyer for companies like Aetna Insurance, a new startup called American Telephone and Telegraph. The railroad industry was consolidating in New England, and so he had many corporate clients, but he also inherited some money from his father's sister. And so he was one of the wealthiest people in Connecticut, one of the largest landholders as well. So here's just a couple of highlights about people he knew. Of those presidents, he was probably closest with Calvin Coolidge. They had a lot in common. They were both New England farm boys. So this is Calvin Coolidge at McLean's estate. You can see a warming cabin in the background there. And one of the things I like to point out about Calvin Coolidge is that he actually smiled. And this is one of the things I try to do in my book, is to really make these people, including Senator McLean, real, not just to draw upon some of the images that we have, the stereotypes we have of the presidents and various figures in the book. But Coolidge is a prominent figure in the book, and they were very close friends. So I said McLean led an interesting life, but an interesting life is not enough, I think, to justify a book. He led an important life. He was the leader of passage of the 1918 Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And if there's one thing I'd like you to take away about the MBTA, is just this, that it prohibits the taking, which includes killing, capturing, selling, trading, transporting of a set of protected migratory birds. And now we have over 1,000 of them. So I think we all know that you can't have a pet cardinal in your house. You can't just shoot a woodpecker that might be bothersome to you that's drilling holes in your house even. These are birds that are protected. And the reason they're protected is because of this very important legislation that I'll be talking about today. I wanted to put in this shameless plug about my book. I had the pleasure of getting an endorsement from David Sibley, who's a well-known figure in birds. He's an author, an illustrator, and I think he really summarizes what my book is all about. It's about the time in which McLean lived. So it gives you insights into the politics of this period in the early 20th century, and also it's a story about a person. I think it's an inspiring story. The commitment he had to get this legislation passed in the face of tremendous opposition. So I think Mr. Sibley really captures the essence of the book in this review that he gave me. So the key problem that McLean and others faced in the early 1900s were declining bird populations due to a couple of factors. First, birds have always been hunted as a source of protein since the beginning of time. But as the population grew after the Civil War, from around 31 million people in 1865 to 71 million by 1900, there were more mouths to feed. And as people moved west, this is the era before refrigeration, they shot birds that were consumed in restaurants. They were often just consumed locally. And so the amount of bird hunting that went on for food was rising rapidly after the Civil War. But secondly, there was a trend for primarily ladies to wear and adorn their hats with feathers. Here's a factoid for you. The Titanic, when it sunk, the most valuable cargo on board were a shipment of feathers that were going from London to New York. Some $3 million worth of feathers in today's money were being shipped. This was a very popular way for women to accessorize their fashions. It was almost like a respectable woman wouldn't be caught in public without a hat, almost as like you wouldn't be caught without shoes. It was that central to people's dress at that time. And so ornate feathers were the fashion of the day. And so there was a great deal of hunting for plumage value. But the third factor that I think really came into play in McLean's lifetime was the advent of the automatic shotgun, as you can see here. This really supercharged the hunting of birds after it was introduced, I think around 1892. And so the level of hunting of birds went from hundreds of thousands per year to millions of birds per year. And this went on for decades, leading up to the time that McLean entered the Senate in 1911. And what's most insidious about this is as the supply of birds declined, their value went up, especially for this plumage for hats. And so people went out to hunt even more. So that was essentially the challenge that McLean faced going into the Senate, was how to put an end to this hunting. And one other footnote is that these laws were all state laws. And so each state was free to set their own hunting laws. And the most outrageous one that I found was in Missouri, that had one hunting law in this time period, and that was you couldn't hunt on Sunday. But otherwise, you could hunt wherever you wanted, however much, at any time of the year. So now I'm going to turn to a couple of challenges that McLean faced that I think shaped and equipped him to take on this challenge of passing the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. His life story is really a rags to riches story. He grew up on a subsistence 100-acre farm. He had no real advantages as far as family money or recognition. When he graduated from high school, he said he had two ambitions. One was to become the editor of the largest newspaper in Connecticut, which is where he's from, and secondly, to become president of the United States. Now, this was not said tongue-in-cheek. I think a key to understanding George P. McLean is his driving ambition. And he wanted to become president, and you'll see as his career unfolded that he had that type of resume that would have prepared him for such an office. So he graduated from high school and became a lawyer. He didn't go to college. He moved to Hartford, and he first started out as a newspaper reporter, as his ambition was dictating. But what happened was he met a lot of politicians covering them for his newspaper, and they saw in McLean a very ambitious young man with great writing and speaking ability. And so they nurtured him and suggested that they mentored him and suggested that he go to law school. And he did. And that was really his way out of this impoverished background, was through a career in the law. So the second challenge was him forging his own path as a political reformer. And it began in his 20s. He was a state legislator in Connecticut. And then in his 30s, he was the U.S. Attorney, a federal job. He was appointed by then President Benjamin Harrison to be U.S. Attorney for Connecticut. And then he reached really the pinnacle of his early political career. At age 43, he became governor of Connecticut. And I want to touch on a couple of the reforms that he initiated at this early stage of his life, because I think those are forerunners of the role he took on when he was in the U.S. Senate. As a state legislator, he helped create what was called the Connecticut Board of Pardons. Now, this took the place of pardons being granted by the Connecticut legislature directly. And this gets back to that theme about Abraham Lincoln saying they needed to think anew and do things anew, because the earlier colonial founders of Connecticut wanted to put the the pardoning power in the hands of the legislature to keep it away from a governor, a royal figure. But what that did by the time McLean was in the legislature was very corrupt. Pardons were bought and sold by these part-time legislators in Connecticut. And so he instituted the Connecticut Board of Pardons, which was a 9-member commission that exists still today with the governor and some lay people to help grant pardons by unanimous vote, taking it out of that corrupt hands of the legislature. And this really put him on the political map in his 20s, and he got a lot of recognition for that. And then as a governor, he continued this theme of being a reform-minded governor. He was elected in 1900, and he had a very ambitious agenda for reform. Time doesn't permit me to go through that, but in a sense, he alienated his own party, the Republican Party, by pushing for reforms to democratize the system of representation in Connecticut. He also advocated women's suffrage at this local and state level. He also pushed for tax reform and some other things that his mentors felt were almost of a betrayal to them. So he lost a great deal of their support and went through a very difficult time during his time as governor. This time as governor really ruined his plans to become president of the United States. He pushing for these reforms. He lost the support of his party, and he went into a period in the political wilderness, I like to call it. And for 11 years, he was out of the public eye. He went through a very difficult mental, nervous breakdown due to his very turbulent time as governor and losing the support of his mentors and his own party. And so emerging from this political wilderness, it was a stunning political comeback. And I think that's part of the inspiring nature of his life story, is that he was left for politically dead at age 44, and he found a way back into public service. Being a millionaire, his net worth at this time was somewhere around $40 million in today's money. He could have just ended his career in politics altogether and lived the good life, the Jay Gatsby life of a millionaire in the early 1900s. But instead of living that good life, I like to say he wanted to live a better life. And that was to use his talents and skills and experiences in a new setting, not president, but in the United States Senate. So I'm going to just show you this graphic. I hope you can see he was in the U.S. Senate for 18 years. He was instrumental in passing much of this legislation. He certainly weighed in on it, and 3 constitutional amendments he voted on, also the entry into World War I, the Federal Reserve Act, League of Nations, many other issues. So I think if you like history, you'll see how he and others went through evaluating these different very important changes in our nation's history, and how he helped influence much of the passage of this legislation. So I see my time is coming to a close here. I wanted to share with you, though, some interesting information for those of you who are interested in Gifford Pinchot. They were contemporaries. You can see this as a photograph, McLean on the left, Pinchot on the right. They traveled in similar social circles, I like to say, and they had a very important shared friendship, namely that would be Theodore Roosevelt. McLean was interviewed for Secretary of the Navy in 1902 by Theodore Roosevelt. They were very close in Roosevelt's early political career. There's a number of anecdotes in my book about Theodore Roosevelt, an extraordinary human being. But I think as time went on, their paths diverged. McLean was a very loyal Republican, probably center of the party. And when Theodore Roosevelt left the Republican Party to run for president in 1912, I think that was probably a point where their relationship changed for the worse. And I know that Pinchot and Roosevelt were close throughout their lifetimes. But there is some mention of Pinchot in the book, and I think they definitely traveled in the same circles and occupied that same era of being conservationists in the progressive era. So let me just touch on very quickly McLean's legacy. I think it's not a stretch to say he saved birds from extinction. There were a number of birds that were on the verge of extinction, birds like the snowy egret, the flamingo, the wood duck, the trumpeter swan, others that were used for hats. And so the plumage trade was seriously impacted by this legislation. And I think it also helped contribute to this coming out of fashion to adorn feather hats with these kinds of materials. Secondly, I think it's important to point out that this was the first time that the federal government was engaged in overseeing the environment, a role that we more or less take for granted today. But what the MBTA stands for is it really helped end the states' rights stranglehold over conservation. There's a fascinating narrative here as to how they were able to overcome the challenge that was headed for the Supreme Court to strike down what was then thought of as the Weeks-McLean bill. And what was fascinating is that they put it in the form of a treaty. That's why it's called the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And that way, because the supremacy clause of the Constitution, this legislation could not be struck down by the Supreme Court. But it really did pave the way for the federal government to take on this very important oversight role that I believe was really that the Migratory Bird Treaty Act was really the forerunner of this future legislation. Another point about McLean's legacy is that it ushered in global conservation, global bird protection in this case, because these were treaties that were signed with other nations, Great Britain, and now there's many signatory nations with the Global Migratory Bird Treaty Act. It ushered in this idea of global cooperation. Birds migrate, they don't just stay in one nation. And so to protect them in their home nations when they migrate is equally important to just legislation that would have been confined to the United States only. Lastly, I wanted to share with you another legacy for McLean. He was one of the largest private landholders in Connecticut, and when he died, he wanted to ensure that this land, some 4,000 acres, would be permanently set aside as a game refuge. It is not only a place for recreation with thousands of visitors every year, but it's a place where research is conducted in the area of forestry. There are tremendous virgin forest areas of the game refuge. I've listed a couple highlights here. And the director of the game refuge is Connor Hogan. I've met him. He is a Yale master's in forestry graduate, and he oversees a very important research and conservation and education effort, as well as keeping miles of trails available for hiking and recreation. So in summary, my book about McLean shows how he learned from his successes and his failures to lead this legislation. It took almost 7 years to get this passed in the Senate. It took on various forms until it finally reached the point of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. He helped end the states' rights stranglehold over the environment and pave the way for the federal government to take on the role that we see today. And in summary, I think he really was the right person at the right time to do the right thing for protecting birds and conservation generally.
Well, thank you so much for that. You brought up Gifford Pinchot, and I was reading your book over the weekend and noted not only are they both natives of Simsbury, but then they wind up actually being next door neighbors in Washington. And so I was wondering if there was if you had a little more you wanted to share about Pinchot and McLean,
Yeah,
um, in any way, shape, or form, because there's history there, and they're different. There's many ways you can go with this. So I'll just throw it
yeah.
into.
Well, I think one of the differences between the two was that McLean was in essence a politician with an interest in conservation, whereas Pinchot was a conservationist with an interest in politics. The emphasis of the two were very different. Um, I think McLean was very comfortable in the world of politics. He loved the stir and the clash of running for office. He held many offices throughout his lifetime, and winning 3 consecutive senatorial terms was no small feat. So I think, in fairness to Pinchot, I think he was much more of a naturalist. He was a Yale graduate. He came from wealth. McLean did not, but McLean entered the world of wealth later on in life. So I think they traveled very similar um, paths, but I think the question of emphasis was different. I think perhaps Pinchot was more of a devotee of Theodore Roosevelt when Roosevelt became more of um, a radical Republican, if I can say that. His stances were more radical than McLean. McLean was definitely a centrist. He was very comfortable with William Howard Taft, for example. They were very close. And so I think they probably diverged over specific issues. The social issues, I would assume Pinchot was more liberal, more progressive. Women's suffrage, he probably would have been more progressive than McLean. But I think they did share um, a great interest in the environment together. And on this particular issue, I think they would have been very sympathetic on the federal protection of migratory birds.
I agree. So Josh Howard weighs in from the Senate Historical Office, and he asks, did Senator McLean's work in committees, especially as the chair of the Forest Reservations Committee, have an impact upon his conservation activities, or how would that have had an impact?
Yeah, I do talk about all of McLean's committee responsibilities in the Senate because at that time, senators had much more committee work than they do now. I think he had 8 committees initially, and I think most senators now have maybe half that amount. But in any case, he took on the forest committee in the Senate willingly, and he took it on from someone else who felt that it was a very unimportant activity. McLean's first speech, his maiden speech in the Senate, was on the topic of protecting migratory birds and resurrecting some federal legislation from John Weeks, the representative from Massachusetts. He basically brought that back to the Congress. And so that was a very important committee that he ran. He had hearings there to publicize the Migratory Bird Treaty Act at various periods. And so it was a very important part of his work in the Senate. He took it very seriously. It was a moribund activity, I think, before he willingly signed up for it. And that was instrumental, I think, in the techniques that he used to publicize this, the hearings, the people he brought before that committee to get this legislation passed.
And we should say, connected back to Pinchot. Pinchot was no longer chief of the Forest Service when McLean entered the Senate. He'd been out for a year or so. Chuck Nicholson asks if you would elaborate on what drove McLean's interest in birds. For example, was he active in early Audubon societies and other ornithological clubs?
Well, McLean grew up on this 100-acre farm in Simsbury, which is about 20 miles from Hartford. It's an idyllic place, even today. But back then, it was just a paradise for wildlife, for birds. He grew up on this farm. He was the youngest, and he hated farming. He did not like to get his hands dirty. And I think in many ways, he had a sort of a dreamy personality. He fell in love with nature at an early age. He also came from a very strongly Calvinistic congregational family. His grandfather was a Yale graduate, much in the mold of like a Jonathan Edwards preacher.
Mm.
And I think for McLean, he took some of that energy of religion and put it into nature. In other words, he saw almost a spiritual dimension to nature as reflected in many of the poets that he liked, Whittier, Longfellow, Emerson, these others, where nature was now being put into a very naturalistic, spiritual plane. And so I think that was partly why he believed so deeply in protecting birds and nature, was because he almost had a religious zeal on the subject. And as a hunter, he initially was enthusiastic about it, but with the advent of the automatic shotgun, the pump shotgun, he really began to question his hunting. And eventually he renounced hunting as an adult because he saw this needless slaughter of birds that was done for profit making, for the hat industry, also for hunting, for food. And so I think that his keen awareness of, as a hunter, they say hunters make the best conservationists, was also one of the reasons why he was so committed to righting the wrongs that he saw around him of this excessive, needless killing of birds.
Was he a member of the Boone and Crockett Club?
I don't know if he was a member. I don't believe so. I think by that point, well, that's been around quite a bit. He may have been. But as far as Audubon Society, yes, he was active in the Audubon Society. He was a honorary president of the Connecticut Audubon. He interacted with many people forming these clubs around that time, the late 1900s, early 1900s. And in my book, I do document the very important role that women played in the formation of these Audubon clubs. Some 80% of the members were women, leadership were largely women, and this was an extremely important part of the growth and the influence of the Audubon Society, with the role of women in formulating that. And he interacted with many of them.
I'm going to tie two questions together. One is from Mac McClure, who asks, how old was McLean when he came into his inheritance? And then someone else asked, how did he get enough money to go to college given his impoverished background?
Yeah. Well, he was about 43 years old when he inherited in those years $3 million. And that is equivalent today to almost 30 million. I think it was 1906 he inherited this money. His father's sister was a socialite. She went to what I guess you'd call it a finishing school, the
Hmm.
Porter School in Connecticut. I believe that's where Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis went to school, and she was at that time Jacqueline Bouvier.
Hmm.
She went to that school and she married two very wealthy New York merchants who were importers, land speculators, and financiers. And when you roll that all up, and she married two of them, they were widowed, and she inherited that money and she bequeathed most of it to George P. McLean. She was a great supporter of his for his political career. Now, McLean did not go to college. He was apprenticed. He took that route that many people did in becoming a lawyer. He apprenticed with a lawyer and passed the bar, but he never did go to college.
Okay.
And there's a story in my book about how he had approached his wealthy aunt to go to college, and she said, "No, I want you to learn self-reliance and figure out a way to forge your own path." So that's a little bit about some of the New England virtues, I guess, that he internalized.
Gotcha. Yeah, and reading for the law. Um, if he had become president, he would have emulated a number of our 19th century presidents who did that.
Hmm.
Um, and also, I'm blanking on the name of the book. There's a book that looks at the conservationists and that tie from New England and that tie to congregationalism and that religious zeal. And Pinchot is part of that background too. So it's another interesting parallel between those two, though
Hmm.
Pinchot was
Hmm.
born to great wealth. Um, Paul Shepard asks if you could comment a little bit about the eradication of the passenger pigeon and connect that up with McLean.
Yeah, that was a very important development in conservation. Um, the passenger pigeon at one time, there was the most prevalent bird in North America, numerically, some 3 to 5 billion. That's with a B. And when they migrated across different areas, they would blot out the sun. There was such a large cloud of these birds. And so when you have this ubiquitous bird that gradually over time starts to disappear, the newspapers really picked up on this. And the last surviving passenger pigeon died in 1914, I believe, at the Cincinnati Zoo. And so there was almost like this death watch for the death of that final passenger pigeon. And I think it was a wake-up call to the nation that how could this bird that had been so prevalent and so common go extinct? It wasn't like some bird that no one had ever interacted with. And so the newspaper coverage of that event was significant. Um, I think that it captured the public's imagination that there was something wrong with what they all loved, and that was modernization, industrialization. People loved the changes that were occurring within society, but I think they began to sense that they were losing something valuable. And there were other birds that were on the brink of extinction, like the snowy egret I mentioned. And I think it was that was sort of the tipping point, I believe, in public consciousness to support the idea that something had to be done to prevent further extinctions.
Yeah, and it's also the same time as the attempts to save the buffalo and the white-tailed deer here in the east. Uh, Pat Sanner asks if you could talk a little bit more about how the Migratory Treaty Act was used and was effective, but more, I like this question. How did he go about negotiating the treaty or can you
Yeah.
differentiate? Because as you said, if it were a law, it gets challenged in the court system, but by going with the treaty, it bypasses that problem. So how did this, can,
Hmm.
I understand, I'm asking you to recite a chapter from your book, but if you could
Well,
summarize that.
I had always been confused about what was the Weeks-McLean Act, which was passed, I think, in 1916, and what is the Migratory Bird Treaty, which was 1918. So the Weak-McLean Act was passed in 1916, but McLean and others knew that it was going to be struck down by the Supreme Court. And so the idea of putting it in the form of a treaty was raised by, I believe it was a senator from New York, Elihu Root. And so it was refashioned into that. But I think what is critically important about developing a consensus was the process that McLean utilized in that fashion. Having been unsuccessful as a reformer, as a governor, he knew how to overcome many of the obstacles that he faced there. And so he involved many different organizations, like gun manufacturers, for one thing. There was many in Connecticut that he had a good relationship with. He brought them on board. Business people like Henry Ford, the naturalists of that time, John Burroughs and others, were also brought in to support this. But what's critically important, and I think fascinating, is how he formed a partnership with then President Woodrow Wilson, who was a Democrat, and McLean and was a Republican. They had very little in common, but this was an area they did share. And it's important to note that the treaty was passed in July of 1918. There were a lot of things going on in the world at that time. The U.S. was fully committed to war in Europe. Those were very difficult months for the country to be in Europe at war. There was a global flu pandemic. We all know about pandemics. That was also occurring. And so the delay and the stall tactics that had been going on for decades on conservation legislation for birds, at least, they were going to use that again and say that we can't address issues about birds when we're in a world war. But McLean and Wilson came together, and on July 3rd, 1918, this legislation was signed. The pen was given by Wilson to McLean. And so I think this is a tremendous example of bipartisanship. And we know in history, much of our great legislation, the civil rights legislation, for example, this was bipartisan. And it's very refreshing to see that. And we can only envy that today, bipartisanship. But this is a great example of it, of Wilson and McLean coming together to push this legislation across the finish line at a very difficult time in our nation's history.
So Elizabeth asks, and this is something you and I were talking about the other day, did the law cover just migratory birds, or were non-migratory birds included? You and I were talking also about birds, specifically predatory birds, that were left off the protection list.
Yes. It was astonishing for me to learn in the course of writing this book, researching this book, that the entire class of raptors, which includes the bald eagle, were excluded from the species list. I'm researching that now, and one of the things I'm learning is that there was a compromise of sorts to get this legislation passed, that class of birds, all hawks, raptors are called, bald eagle, were omitted and excluded from the list because many business interests, farmers, ranchers wanted to continue to hunt those birds they considered vermin, like a coyote. So those birds were entirely excluded, and to the detriment, because the bald eagle was eventually near extinction, not just because of DDT, but because of excessive hunting. There was a bounty on hunting of bald eagles in Alaska up through the 1950s, $1 a bird, and 100,000 eagles were killed in Alaska. Tens of thousands were killed in the continental United States by ranchers in Texas and elsewhere in California. So that was certainly an omission. But so there was some form of a compromise to get this legislation passed there. And that's a story that I think needs to be better told, because I believe it brings into focus as to what is important about protecting the environment. Can we really put value judgments on classes of animals, birds, to say some are less valuable than others? And in my opinion, it was the conservationists like Aldo Leopold that reoriented people's thinking away from picking and choosing which birds which animals could be protected based on what humans value, but based on their inherent value to the overall system in nature.
We have a question from Doak Nickerson, who asks, given the nature of migratory birds, did the MBTA have international reach or implications with other countries? If you can elaborate on that.
Yes, the treaty was initially signed by Great Britain on behalf of Canada in 1918. So again, this was negotiated during World War I. And so that covered Canada. Our relationship with Mexico in 1918 was very poor. You might know about the incursions into Mexico during the Wilson administration to hunt down Pancho Villa, and there was a very poor relationship between Mexico and the United States. So that came later. There are now, I believe, a dozen countries that have signed on to the MBTA, including Russia, many South American countries. And it really served as the boilerplate for other legislation in other parts of the world. But it really, I think, was set the standard for global bird protection and is still in force today. I think that's what's really important, is this is now 100 years old plus, and it has been very effective over this 100-year period.
Great, yeah. Let's see. I'm not sure if you answered this one yet. Let's see, Jerry Lynn Levy asks, can you explain how enforcement was strengthened between the Lacey Act, the Weeks-McLean Act, or the law, and the Migratory Act?
Yes. The Lacey Act was using the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution, and it is still in effect as well today. I've talked to some people on my bird talks, author talks, who say that it's still being enforced today, but it primarily is aimed at the interstate commerce of trafficking in birds. So what I think the Migratory Bird Treaty Act did is it built on that, but it extended it to creating law, preempting the state hunting laws that were so destructive to birds. For instance, the federal laws about hunting prohibit a spring hunting season. You can only hunt in the fall now, in other words. Before the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, one of the most popular and destructive habits was what they called the spring hunting season, where birds were on their nests and migrating through different flyways, and millionaire hunting clubs sprung up along these migratory paths, and people would go out and hunt birds in the spring. And if you want, that's a fast track to extinction if you want to kill a bird while it's nesting with its young. And so what the Migratory Bird Treaty Act did is it preempted many of these state laws that allowed for things like spring hunting. And the Lacey Act was a little bit more of a narrow focus on prohibiting the interstate commerce of birds. So the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, I think, was more comprehensive across the U.S. and also extending into the nations that signed the treaty as well.
Great, thanks very much for answering that. Any parting words for us, Will?
I think there's some synergy between the Forest History Society and my book. The conservation era, the progressive era, in other words, it's really the heart and soul of my book. And as I said at the outset of my talk, I've always felt that I learn by reading about things I'm familiar with from a different perspective. And I think you'll be enriched to learn about Presidents Roosevelt, Presidents Wilson, Taft, and then how different things became in the 1920s. There was a window of time In other words, that I think this legislation could pass, and that was the progressive era. The 1920s, the focus became on the era of normalcy, the time of peace and prosperity. And it was this progressive era when a group of leaders came forward to really address long-standing, simmering problems, including conservation. And I think you'll deepen your appreciation for that time if you read my book, and I think you'll benefit from that to increase your own knowledge of the conservation era.
Yes, thank you so much, Will.